Why did the radio suddenly go quiet right when everyone expected the patrol to die? They were pinned on three sides, dirt exploding around them, breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The ravine had become a narrow coffin of stone and dust, and every step felt like a mistake already paid for. Someone screamed for air support again, the words cracking through static, desperate enough to sound like a prayer. Nothing came back. Just the hiss of a radio that didn't care if you lived. She wasn't supposed to be there. Far above them, pressed flat against cold rock, she watched the trap close exactly the way she'd feared. The pattern was obvious to her in the way it never was to command. The choke points, the overlapping lanes, the patience. This wasn't chaos. This was preparation. And she felt the familiar, bitter twist in her chest, the one that came when experience was ignored because it didn't wear the right rank anymore. She had warned them, quietly, professionally, and been told to stand down. Now, below her, people were paying for that decision. Her breathing slowed, not because she felt calm, but because panic was useless. Panic wasted time. Panic wasted lives. She let the world narrow until it was nothing but wind, distance, and the slow rise and fall of her chest. The rifle felt like an extension of her pulse, steady even as something inside her ached with old memories she never talked about. She picked her first target carefully, not the loudest, not the closest. The one whose body language said leadership, confidence, control. The shot disappeared into the noise of the firefight like it had never existed. Down below, a man fell, and no one understood why. "Who fired that?" someone yelled. She didn't answer, she never did. Another hostile shifted, confused now, leaning out to see what had gone wrong. She watched him long enough to be sure. Then the second shot broke clean and final, a whisper swallowed by chaos. Two bodies down, no warning, no explanation. In the ravine, something changed. Not hope yet, just doubt. And doubt was the first crack in any ambush. She felt the familiar weight settle into her chest, the one that came every time she chose to act. Because acting meant responsibility. And responsibility had cost her more than anyone ever wrote down. But she kept working, because stopping was not an option she allowed herself anymore. How did fear move so quickly from one side of the valley to the other? The rangers didn't know her name yet. They didn't know her face. All they knew was that every time a hostile tried to reposition, someone dropped. Every time an RPG appeared, it never got fired. The enemy had built a perfect kill zone, and now it was unraveling without explanation. She wasn't suppressing. She wasn't trying to be loud. She was doing what she had always done best, removing problems before they became funerals. Her mind tracked wind shifts, micro-movements, the way confidence leaked out of men when control slipped through their fingers. She read intent in shoulders and hesitation in hands. She fired only when it mattered, and she waited when it didn't. Below, the lieutenant felt it before he understood it, the pressure lifting, the rhythm changing. He stopped shouting and started watching. Every clean shot bought them seconds. Every pause in enemy fire created a gap. "We move when they pause," he said finally, trusting something he couldn't see. They did 10 meters, then 20. Ground that had been untouchable became survivable, not because they were stronger, not because they were louder, but because someone unseen was rewriting the math. She felt a quiet, grim satisfaction, not pride exactly. Pride required recognition. This was something colder, a sense of things being set right if only temporarily. Still, a familiar ache pressed in, because she knew how this ended. It always ended with silence. The last hostile fell far uphill at a distance that would have made most people hesitate. She didn't. The shot felt almost gentle, necessary. The valley went still in a way that felt wrong at first, too sudden, too complete. She didn't move for long seconds after. Stillness mattered. Rushing got people killed. Only when she was sure did she rise, shedding the terrain slowly, deliberately, becoming visible for the first time. Down below, weapons lowered without anyone ordering it. Shock replaced fear. Someone whispered a word that sounded like disbelief. She climbed carefully, every step measured, the weight of the rifle familiar on her shoulder. She reached the wounded ranger first. Old habits didn't fade. Hands checked pressure, tourniquets, breathing. She spoke softly, steadily, the way you spoke to someone whose life you were actively holding together. "You'll make it," she said, and meant it. Only then did the lieutenant find his voice. "Ma'am, who are you?" She paused. She always did. Truth was a complicated thing. Titles carried weight she no longer wanted. Finally, she said the only answer that mattered. "Overwatch." Recognition hit one of them like a delayed explosion. "Your voice," he said. "You're supposed to be retired." A faint smile flickered. It didn't last. "I am." Why did she stay when walking away would have been easier? They asked her why she was there, why she came when she'd been told not to. She didn't answer right away. She looked back up the ridge at the ground that had told her the truth long before radios did. "Because patterns repeat," she said, "and people forget." They understood enough. Stories connected. A name no one said out loud. A career that never officially existed. Missions that ended quietly, without ceremonies or applause. A woman who judged success by the number of people who went home breathing. She didn't stay long, she never did. When the rotors came, she was already erasing herself from the terrain. No report, no credit, just a card pressed into the lieutenant's hand. Coordinates, corrections, warnings written in clean, precise script. "Fix this," she said, "before the ground teaches you again." He asked if they'd see her again. She adjusted her strap, already turning away. "Only if you're surrounded." Then she was gone. What stays with people long after the gunfire stops? The story traveled the way stories always do, quietly at first, then louder. How the fire stopped without warning. How control returned without orders. How survival came not from force but from restraint. One shot at a time. Each one chosen. Each one necessary. Somewhere in those mountains she still watched, still waited, not because she needed to prove anything, but because dignity didn't need permission. Sometimes it doesn't speak at all. It simply acts. Why did her hands start shaking only after the shooting stopped? The silence settled in layers, heavy and unnatural, like the valley itself was holding its breath. She hated this part most. Not the gunfire, not the decisions. The quiet afterward, when the body finally remembered what it had just been through. When the adrenaline drained and left behind the truth. She crouched behind stone, breaking down her rifle with the same careful movements she'd used for decades. Muscle memory did the work while her mind drifted where it always tried to go when she wasn't careful. Faces, names, the ones she'd saved, the ones she hadn't reached in time, the ones no one ever knew she'd watched disappear through glass. She forced the thoughts back down. Not now, never now. Below her, rotors thundered closer. Extraction, order restored, a clean ending if you believed in those. She didn't. Endings were just pauses people gave meaning to because they needed to sleep afterward. She slung her pack and stood, legs stiff, joints reminding her she wasn't 20 anymore. Retirement had taken the edge off her body, not her instincts. Those stayed sharp, almost cruelly so. You never forgot how to read ground once it had tried to kill you. She started moving uphill away from the sound, choosing a route that avoided skyline and shadow traps. Each step was deliberate. Survival wasn't dramatic. It was boring, careful, repetitive. People who chased excitement didn't last long. As she climbed, the radio murmured softly in her ear. She never switched it off. Old habit, old guilt. Command traffic flowed in clipped tones, already turning chaos into reports and timelines. She listened without engaging. She wasn't part of that world anymore, officially. Unofficially, that was always harder. A younger voice cut through the net, tension still sharp. "We had unknown Overwatch. single shooter, extremely effective. Unknown. The word sat heavy in her chest. Unknown meant uncontrollable, uncomfortable. It meant questions no one liked asking. She reached a narrow saddle and paused, letting the wind cool her face. That's when her hands started to tremble, not violently, just enough to notice, enough to remind her she was human whether she liked it or not. She clenched them, then forced herself to relax. Shaking didn't mean weakness. It meant the cost had finally arrived. Her mind slipped uninvited back to the briefing room years ago. A different valley, different command, same pattern. She sat at the end of the table, quiet, overlooked, her assessment dismissed because it didn't match the plan already approved. She spoken anyway. She always did. And when it went wrong, she'd been the one sent in to fix it. They called it heroism afterward. She called it arithmetic. That mission had ended differently. Too many variables, too many moving parts, one mistake that couldn't be undone. A voice on the radio that cut off mid-sentence and never came back. That was the day something inside her cracked, thin and invisible, like stress in glass. She finished the climb and melted back into terrain, just another shadow among rocks. From here, she could see the valley spread out below, harmless now, almost peaceful. It made her stomach tighten. Places didn't look dangerous once they'd had their fill. She pulled out a weathered notebook and made a few notes. Wind behavior, enemy movement patterns, a habit she never broke, even when no one was asking for reports anymore. Knowledge wasted was something she couldn't stand. Why did she keep coming back when no one expected her to? She told herself it was about prevention, about stopping patterns before they repeated. That was true, but not complete. The harder truth lived somewhere deeper, somewhere she didn't like visiting. She needed to know she still could. After retirement, the silence had been worse than any firefight. Days without purpose stretched thin and brittle. People thanked her for her service, asked what she planned to do next, as if the skill of watching men die from a mile away translated neatly into hobbies. She tried normal, tried distance, tried telling herself she'd earned rest, but rest felt like abandonment, like turning her back on a language only she still spoke fluently. So when the intel flagged movement through this sector, when the ground lit up in her mind with warning signs no algorithm caught, she packed her rifle without telling anyone. Not because she wanted permission, because she already knew the answer. She exhaled slowly, watching dust curl through sunlight. Below, the last of the Rangers lifted off, their silhouettes shrinking until they were nothing but sound and memory. She stayed long after they were gone, scanning, listening, making sure the valley didn't have one more surprise left. Only then did she allow herself to feel it. The fear, not of dying. That part had dulled long ago. It was the fear of being needed again, of knowing that if she stayed sharp, if she stayed close, she'd never truly be free, that the world would keep pulling her back with emergencies and almosts and what-ifs. Her radio crackled softly. "Unknown Overwatch," a senior voice said, now calmer, curious. "If you're out there, you saved lives today." She closed her eyes. Praise always landed wrong, too heavy, too late. She didn't answer. She moved again as the sun shifted, descending into a fold of land that hid her from anything with eyes or glass. Her route took her past an old fighting position, weathered and half-collapsed. She paused, crouched, ran a hand over the stone. Another ambush long ago, different war, same lessons ignored. That was when the doubt crept in, quiet, persistent. What if she missed something next time? She was good, she knew that, but good wasn't infallible, and every year added weight to decisions that had to be perfect. The thought scared her more than bullets ever had. She imagined the lieutenant back at base, debriefing, struggling to explain how survival had arrived without warning. She hoped he kept the card she'd given him close, hoped he listened next time the ground spoke. She walked until dusk softened the edges of everything. Her body ached now, the kind of deep soreness that came from hours of tension finally releasing. She welcomed it. Pain was honest. As night settled, she found a hide she'd marked years earlier and set up quietly. No fire, no light, just observation. She didn't expect trouble, but expectation had a way of betraying you. She lay back against stone and stared at the sky. Stars emerged one by one, indifferent and steady. She felt small beneath them, and for once she didn't fight that feeling. Small meant replaceable, and replaceable meant maybe, someday, unnecessary. Her eyes closed briefly. Sleep tugged at her, gentle but insistent. Before she gave in, one last thought surfaced, unbidden. If Command had listened, she wouldn't have fired a single shot today. The idea carried no bitterness, just truth. Somewhere below, lives went on because she'd refused to stay silent. Somewhere else, paperwork would never mention her name. She was fine with that, always had been. She shifted, settling into rest at last, knowing morning would come whether she was ready or not, knowing patterns would repeat, knowing she'd probably answer again. Not for recognition, not for glory, but because when you understand how fragile survival really is, turning away stops being an option. And sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought in valleys at all, but in the quiet space where you decide who you still are. Why did the guilt arrive before the gratitude ever could? Morning came without asking her permission. It always did. Pale light slid across the rocks and found her where she hadn't really slept, just drifted in and out of shallow rest. Her body knew the difference. So did her mind. She rose slowly, joints stiff, breath steady, scanning before she even fully stood. Habit wasn't something you turned off. It was something that lived with you like a second spine. The valley below looked harmless again. That was the lie terrain always told once it was finished with you. She packed up in silence, every movement economical, leaving nothing behind that said she'd been there. No footprints that mattered. No signs a trained eye couldn't dismiss as coincidence. She learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you could leave behind was proof. As she moved east, the radio stayed quiet, too quiet. That bothered her more than chatter ever did. Silence meant people were thinking, replaying, asking questions. She tried not to imagine the debrief room, the looks exchanged when timelines didn't line up, the pause before someone asked how a single shooter had altered a perfectly set ambush. Someone would pull an old file. Someone always did. A name would hover unspoken in the air, like smoke no one wanted to admit they smelled. She pushed the thought away and focused on the climb. Focus was safer. Still, the guilt pressed in, not sharp but heavy. She saved them. She knew that. But saving people didn't erase the truth underneath it all. This never should have happened. Experience had been sidelined. Pattern recognition dismissed. And she'd paid for it by breaking the one promise she'd made to herself when she walked away. No more unofficial missions. No more watching from the shadows. No more choosing responsibility without authority. Promises made in the aftermath of loss always sounded stronger than they turned out to be. She reached a ridgeline and paused, heart beating a little harder now, not from exertion, from memory. This view mirrored another one years ago, halfway across the world. Same angle, same deceptive calm. That was where she'd made the call that still woke her some nights. She hadn't been wrong, she'd just been too late. Her jaw tightened. She swallowed and kept moving. Why did she keep measuring herself against moments no one else remembered? By midday, she reached a safe drop point where she'd cached supplies months earlier. She drank sparingly, ate without tasting, eyes always scanning. Survival didn't stop just because the shooting did. That lesson had been burned into her early. Her radio crackled again, sudden enough to make her freeze. Still no ID on the Overwatch shooter. She listened hidden as voices circled the same questions she'd heard her entire career. Skill level, distance, timing, probability. Someone suggested a drone team, someone else dismissed it. The tone shifted subtly from curiosity to discomfort. She almost smiled, almost. Discomfort meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant maybe, just maybe, someone would start listening to the ground instead of the plan. But hope was dangerous. She learned that too. She switched the radio off this time, not because she was afraid of being found, because she was tired of hearing herself discussed like a problem to be solved. The trail out took longer than she liked. Loose shale slowed her down and the sun pressed hard against her back. Sweat stung her eyes, mixing with dust. Physical strain grounded her. It kept the mind from wandering too far. Still, thought slipped through. She remembered the first time she'd been ignored. Freshly qualified, younger than most, quieter than all. She spotted a detail no one else had, a shadow where one shouldn't be, a pattern in radio silence. She spoken up and been talked over, then gently corrected by someone with more rank and less time behind glass. They'd gone anyway. That was the day she learned two things: how expensive pride could be, and how invisible competence sometimes was. Later, after she'd proven herself more times than she could count, the ignoring became subtler, less dismissive, more procedural, still just as dangerous. And when she finally left, it wasn't because she'd lost her edge. It was because she was tired of being right only after people died. By late afternoon, she reached the edge of friendly territory. She slowed, blending in less now, letting herself exist a little more openly. The danger had shifted. Out here, it wasn't bullets you worried about. It was questions. She passed a small outpost at a distance, watched through glass as soldiers moved about their routines. Young, focused, alive. The sight tightened something in her chest she pretended not to feel. She could walk in, she knew that, show her face, answer questions, take responsibility openly instead of carrying it alone. The thought lingered longer than she expected. Why didn't she? Because stepping forward meant reopening doors she'd slammed shut for a reason. It meant reports, interviews, debates about protocol and authorization. It meant becoming a symbol again instead of a safeguard. And symbols got used. She turned away and kept walking. As dusk fell, the sky bruised purple and gold. She found a place to sit and finally allowed herself to breathe without counting it. That was when the emotion she'd been avoiding surfaced fully. Pride. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that demanded acknowledgement. A quiet, aching pride that she'd done what she still knew how to do. That she hadn't hesitated. That despite the years, the doubt, the fractures she carried inside, she'd been exactly who those rangers needed when everything went wrong. The pride scared her more than the guilt. Because pride tempted her to stay. Her phone vibrated once in her pack. She hadn't turned it on since leaving, but the signal caught here. A single message preview lit the screen. Heard you were nearby. No sender name, she didn't need one. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, then powered the device off again. Some conversations opened doors that never closed cleanly. Night came fast. Stars emerged, indifferent witnesses to human conflict. She lay back and watched them, feeling the weight of the day settle into her bones. Tomorrow she'd move again, always moving. Staying still made thoughts too loud. As sleep finally took her, one last question surfaced, unanswerable and persistent. How many times could she keep saving people before she admitted she was still at war with herself? The valley was quiet now, but somewhere else another pattern was forming, another set of decisions waiting to be ignored or heeded. And whether she liked it or not, she knew this truth with painful clarity. As long as she could still see the warning signs, she would never truly be done. Why did the memory choose tonight to surface, after she'd sworn it never would? Sleep broke apart without warning, not from noise, not from danger, from a thought that landed too cleanly, too fully formed to ignore. She sat up in the dark, breath already controlled, hand instinctively reaching for a rifle that wasn't there anymore. The night offered nothing but stillness, and somehow that made it worse. She stayed seated for a long moment, letting the past finish what it had started. The mission came back the way it always did, not as a story, but as fragments. A slope washed pale by moonlight. A team moving with confidence they hadn't earned yet. Her voice on the radio, calm, precise, already calculating angles no one else was considering. And then the pause. That fatal pause where command weighed her assessment against the plan they'd already committed to. Negative, the voice had said. We're proceeding. She remembered how she'd closed her eyes for half a second too long. Back then, she still believed authority and wisdom eventually aligned. That belief didn't survive the next 30 minutes. She stood now, restless, packing the edge of her small camp. The stars overhead felt sharper tonight, like they were watching more closely. She learned long ago that grief didn't need anniversaries. It needed weakness, and exhaustion cracked doors nothing else could. She replayed the moment she took the shot that changed everything. The wind had shifted, just slightly, enough that a correction was needed. She made it. She always did. The round had flown true, but truth arrived too late. Another enemy position she hadn't been cleared to engage opened fire first. One voice on her headset cut off mid-word. She finished the mission anyway. Of course she had. Precision didn't falter just because the cost was unbearable. They called it a success in the report. That was the night she stopped sleeping through the dark. Now, years later, she leaned against a rock and let the cold seep through her clothes. She welcomed it. Cold was grounding. Cold reminded her she was still here, still functioning, still capable. The guilt never asked permission. It simply showed up when it sensed space. Why did saving people, now, never feel like enough to cancel out losing them then? She forced herself to move again, walking until her legs burned just enough to pull her back into the present. The horizon was faintly visible, the land unfolding in soft gradients of shadow. Somewhere beyond it, people were waking up to ordinary lives, coffee, routines, conversations that didn't involve kill zones or wind calls. She wondered sometimes what it would feel like to wake without inventorying threats. The thought didn't last long. Her radio stayed off, but that didn't stop her from imagining it crackle back to life. Voices asking questions, offering thanks, requesting explanations she didn't owe but always ended up giving anyway. She reached into her pack and pulled out the weathered card she carried now, the one she duplicated from memory before giving the original to the lieutenant. The grid markings were precise, honest, a quiet confession of how close disaster had come. She traced a finger along the coordinates, jaw tightening. They almost walked into a grave. And she almost stayed retired. The realization landed heavier than she expected. She sat down slowly, letting the weight of that truth settle. Retirement hadn't failed her. She had failed retirement. Because walking away had never been about rest. It had been about survival, hers, not anyone else. She told herself she was done because the cost had grown too high. But standing above that ravine, watching history repeat itself with terrifying accuracy, she'd understood something she'd tried very hard not to. The cost of silence was higher. Dawn crept in reluctantly, washing the landscape in pale gray. She watched it arrive, feeling the familiar tension build in her chest. Morning always brought decisions. Night let you pretend there were none. She packed up slowly, deliberately, each motion a small act of control. Control was a comfort she trusted, people less so. As she moved downslope, she spotted tracks, old ones, not from yesterday, weeks, maybe months, a route used repeatedly. Her mind started mapping automatically, fitting movement into pattern, intention into terrain. She stopped. This wasn't random. The realization sharpened her focus instantly. Whatever cell had set that ambush hadn't vanished with daylight. They repositioned, learned, adjusted. Just like she had. She felt the familiar pull again. That quiet, insistent pressure behind the sternum. The one that asked her to keep watching, to stay just a little longer, to make sure. She cursed under her breath, more tired than angry. This was how it always started. She shadowed the tracks at a distance, careful not to disturb them, letting observation do the work. Her pace slowed. Her world narrowed. The internal conflict rose with every step, the pull between walking away clean and staying long enough to matter. By midday, she confirmed what she'd feared: a fallback position, supplies cached, a place meant to wait out scrutiny before striking again. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. She sat back on her heels and exhaled slowly. If she reported it, command would take time, verify, debate. If she didn't, the pattern would continue unchallenged. She knew how this ended. She'd seen it before. Her hands tightened into fists, then relaxed. Anger was loud. She needed quiet. She took out her notebook and wrote everything down. Distances, likely timelines, possible countermeasures. She wrote as if someone would read it, as if it mattered. Because it did. As the sun dipped again, she made a decision she pretended she hadn't already made hours ago. She repositioned herself into Overwatch, choosing a vantage that offered maximum information with minimal exposure. Just watching, she told herself. No shots, no intervention unless absolutely necessary. The lie tasted familiar. She lay prone as evening returned, eyes steady behind glass. Below, the enemy position came to life subtly, not enough to alarm an untrained observer, enough to confirm intent. Her heart rate slowed, not from calm, from acceptance. This was who she was when the world stripped everything else away. She thought of the lieutenant, of the rangers moving on to their next patrol with lessons learned the hard way. She hoped they'd listen next time. She hoped the card would change something. But hope wasn't a plan. As darkness settled fully, she adjusted her position and whispered to no one, "Not tonight." She didn't fire, she didn't move. She simply stayed. Sometimes, restraint was the hardest skill to master. The stars returned, indifferent as ever. She watched beneath them, a quiet guardian wrestling with the same question she'd avoided for years. Was she protecting others or avoiding herself? The answer didn't come. But morning would. And when it did, she knew this much with painful clarity. Walking away had never been the brave choice. Staying present was. Why did the decision feel heavier now that she wasn't pulling the trigger? She stayed prone through the night, letting hours pass without moving more than a breath. The temptation to act pulsed at the edge of her thoughts, insistent and familiar. It would be easy. One clean shot, a correction to the future before it arrived. She had the angles, she had the wind, she had the skill. She didn't have permission. That mattered more than it used to. She watched instead, counted, timed, learned the rhythm of men who believed they were unseen. Their movements were careful but not cautious. That told her everything. They thought the danger had passed. They thought yesterday had been an anomaly. She almost laughed at that. As dawn crept in, she cataloged faces through glass, assigning no names, only functions. A leader who hesitated before speaking. A runner who checked the same sector twice. A man who carried the radio and never smiled. She felt the old machine inside her click into place, efficient and cold. It frightened her how easily it returned. When the sun rose fully, she pulled back, slipped away without leaving proof. Information was the goal now, not intervention. She told herself that again, slower this time, as if repetition could turn it into truth. By mid-morning, she reached a ridge with signal. She powered on the phone she kept dark and watched messages flood in like a delayed tide. Missed calls, voicemails she didn't open. One message stood out, simple and direct. "You did this again, didn't you?" She closed her eyes. The sender was someone who knew her before the quiet legend grew around her. Someone who'd watched her fight the system as hard as she fought enemies. Someone who'd signed the paperwork that said "retired" and hoped it meant something kinder than it sounded. She typed a reply, deleted it, tried again, deleted that too. Words were dangerous. They invited questions, and questions demanded answers she wasn't ready to give. She powered the phone down and sat with the discomfort. Let it sit. Let it burn. Why was restraint harder than action? Because action ended things. Restraint dragged them out, made you live with the consequences in real time. She moved again, following a long route that took her near a small village at the edge of the valley. Civilian life pressed in here, fragile and stubborn. Children ran between buildings. A man repaired a roof with careful hands. A woman carried water and glanced up at the hills the way people did when they knew danger liked high ground. She stayed distant, always did. She learned that proximity made decisions harder, faces complicated calculations. Still, the sight tightened something in her chest. These were the people who paid for mistakes written in clean fonts on official paper. These were the lives that never showed up in after-action reports. She left the area quietly, carrying that weight with her. By afternoon, she reached a place where she could send information without revealing herself. An old method, slow, reliable. She compiled her notes carefully, stripping out anything that pointed back to her. Terrain, timing, likely intent, enough to matter, not enough to trace. Before she sent it, she hesitated. If command listened, it would validate the choice she'd just made. If they didn't, it would prove the doubt she'd been carrying for years. Either way, something would change. She sent it. The confirmation blinked once, impersonal and final. There she'd done her part. The line she'd promised not to cross held, barely. She expected relief to follow. It didn't. Instead, she felt exposed, like she'd stepped into light after years in shadow and realized she no longer knew how to stand there. Acting quietly had always been her refuge. Transparency demanded a different kind of courage. As evening approached, she found high ground again, not to engage, just to see. The enemy position below showed signs of agitation, increased movement, shorter intervals. Information, it seemed, had traveled faster than she expected. Good, she thought, let uncertainty work for once. Her radio stayed silent. That worried her more than chatter. Silence meant decisions were being made without her input. She had to trust that the warning was enough. Trust had never been her strongest skill. Night fell, and with it came the familiar ache of doubt. She lay back and stared at the sky, letting stars prick holes in the darkness. She thought of the lieutenant back home now, replaying the day in his head. She hoped he slept. She hoped he understood that survival wasn't owed. It was earned and protected, sometimes by people you never met. Her phone vibrated once more. She ignored it at first. Then, reluctantly, she checked. They're asking questions about yesterday. Her breath caught not fear, anticipation. She typed back slowly, let them. A pause, then another message. You could step forward, change how this works. She smiled without humor. Change had never come from stepping forward alone. It came from people listening, and listening had always been the rarest skill in the room. Still, the idea lingered, unwanted, persistent. What if staying hidden was no longer the best way to protect people? She slept poorly, waking often, every sound magnified. Near dawn, she dreamed she was back in that old briefing room, standing at the end of the table, speaking calmly while everyone else talked over her. In the dream, she stopped speaking, just waited. One by one, the voices faded until the room was silent and all eyes turned to her. She woke with her heart racing. Morning came gray and cool. She packed and moved before doubt could catch up. By the time she reached a point overlooking the fallback position again, it was empty, too empty. Her pulse quickened, not panic, focus. They'd moved, which meant either her warning had worked, or it hadn't worked fast enough. She studied the ground, reading fresh tracks with growing concern. The direction told her everything. They weren't retreating. They were adapting. Her jaw set. The familiar equation formed in her mind, cold and clear. She knew where this led. She also knew what it would cost to intervene again. She stayed still for a long moment, weighing consequences she was tired of carrying alone. Then she made a choice that surprised even her. She reached for the radio. Not to fire, not to command, just to speak. "Command," she said quietly, voice steady despite the years. "You have movement you're not seeing, and you don't have much time." The line went silent. Then someone answered. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't hang up. Because sometimes, resilience isn't about acting alone. Sometimes, it's about trusting others to finally listen. Why did her voice feel heavier than the rifle ever had? The radio stayed quiet longer than she expected after she spoke. Not dead air thinking air. She could almost hear it, the shuffle of papers, the quick looks exchanged between people deciding whether to trust a voice without a name attached to it. She didn't rush them. Rushing made people defensive. She learned that lesson the hard way. Finally, a response came through, controlled, careful. "Say again, identify yourself." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, gaze steady on the terrain below. The fallback position was gone now, stripped clean in a way that suggested discipline, not panic. These weren't amateurs. They were adjusting to pressure the way professionals did. "I can't," she said, "but I can tell you where they're going." Silence again, longer this time. She expected resistance. She was ready for it. What she wasn't ready for was the faint shift in tone when the reply finally came. "We're listening." Something loosened in her chest, not relief, recognition. She fed them what she had, roots, timelines. The reason the next ambush wouldn't look like the last one, she didn't speculate, she never did. She spoke only in things she knew. Wind, ground, human behavior under stress, the unglamorous truths that kept people alive. No one interrupted her. When she finished, the officer on the other end spoke quietly. "Stand by." She almost laughed. Stand by. 2 words she'd heard 1,000 times, usually right before someone ignored her anyway. But this time felt different. The pause didn't feel dismissive. It felt deliberate. She stayed prone, watching the valley that had nearly become a grave. The sun climbed, burning off the last of the morning haze. Time moved strangely now, stretched thin between past and future. For the first time in years, she wasn't acting alone. That realization unsettled her more than any firefight. Minutes passed, then the radio crackled again. "We're diverting a unit, adjusting routes. Air is spinning up." Her breath caught just slightly. They believed her. The thought landed harder than any praise ever had. She stayed where she was as the machinery of response came alive. She listened to the cadence change, urgency without panic, movement guided by information instead of hope. This was how it was supposed to work. This was what she'd been fighting for all along, even when she didn't know how to name it. She didn't offer to engage. They didn't ask. There was an unspoken understanding in the space between transmissions. Her role here was observation, not execution, and for once that was enough. As the hours unfolded, reports filtered in, enemy movement disrupted, positions abandoned, a planned strike dissolved before it could begin, no shots fired, no bodies added to anyone's memory. She sat back against the rock and felt something unfamiliar rise up, a cautious, fragile sense of hope. Not the loud kind, the kind you barely trust enough to acknowledge. By late afternoon, the radio traffic slowed. The crisis, if you could call a prevented tragedy that was passing. She powered the radio down and let the quiet return on her terms this time. Her phone buzzed again, same contact, fewer words. They listened. She stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "Good." That was all she sent. She stood slowly, joints protesting, and began the long walk away from the valley. The terrain felt different now, not safer, just resolved, like a chapter that had finally been allowed to close properly. As she moved, memories surfaced, not the sharp ones this time, but the quieter kind. The first instructor who'd taught her patience mattered more than speed. The teammate who'd trusted her call without needing an explanation. The moment she'd realized leadership wasn't about volume, but about clarity. She thought of the lieutenant again, of his steady voice once he found the rhythm, of the way his people had moved when they trusted an unseen hand. She hoped he'd carry that lesson forward, not about her, but about listening. At the edge of the valley, she stopped and looked back one last time. The land was indifferent as it always was. It didn't care who learned or who didn't. It only waited. She turned away. The road out was long and unremarkable, just the way she liked it. As evening fell, she felt the weight she'd carried for years shift just a fraction. Not gone, never gone, but shared at last with a system that had finally paused long enough to hear a warning before it became an obituary. She reached her vehicle as night settled fully. Before getting in, she rested a hand on the door and allowed herself one deep breath that wasn't measured or tactical, just human. She didn't know what came next. Maybe questions, maybe scrutiny, maybe a quiet return to the shadows she knew so well, or maybe something else entirely. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to decide that alone. She drove away under a sky full of indifferent stars, carrying with her the same skills, the same scars, but a different understanding of strength. Strength wasn't just about enduring. It was about knowing when to speak, and trusting that sometimes your voice would be enough. Somewhere behind her, people slept through the night because a pattern had been broken before it could repeat. They would never know her name. They didn't need to. That was fine, because dignity doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't raise its voice or ask to be seen. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it warns. And when the moment comes, it simply acts.